And a very pleasant good evening to you folks. I am Biff Kensington, and you are tuned in to the last call for the Queen City Express. It is Saturday, well, technically Sunday now. Sunday, April 22nd, 2018, 12:02 a.m., coming to you about 2 minutes late, but I don't really care tonight. My poor Boston Red Sox had their winning streak snapped in the most embarrassing way possible, got no hit. Congratulations to Sean, I believe his name is pronounced Mahea. I was too busy banging my head on the keyboard to catch the official pronunciation. But a no hitter, no hitter for the Oakland Athletics tonight against the hottest team in baseball. So that's always fun. Also, Kyle Busch won tonight in Richmond in a race that I would rather forget. Not a Kyle Busch fan. So let's do a little bit of therapy, guys. I appreciate everyone that's going to be popping in here tonight. I want to thank everybody for the kind words they've had over the last week. I've had some good feedback for this show, and that's really what I'm doing it for, guys. If you were enjoying it, then I'm going to keep doing it. It's as simple as that. So appreciate anybody that jumps in the live stream tonight. I appreciate everybody that's giving it a listen. I appreciate everyone that's participated in our trivia challenge. This is the last week for the Ultimate QC Trivia Contest. Of course, over the last couple of weeks, we've had a couple of trivia questions that we've asked on air. We'll have our final one for the drawing here tonight. Very simple. If it's your first show, I ask the question, provide the email address for you to send in your answer to. You answer it correctly, you're entered into the contest. You only need one question to enter. I'll be given the final question. The drawing will take place next week, live on the air. That'll be our special wrap-up show for the Greatest Royal Rumble event as well. So a lot of cool stuff coming at you next week here on the last call. Tonight will be the last question. Basically, it's quite simple. You get picked in the drawing and you get a nice little souvenir pack. Have a lot of cool gear from the Superdome in New Orleans. Now, this wasn't purchased from some street vendor. I actually stood in line for like 19 hours to get this stuff. So hopefully the winner enjoys it. At last check, I think we had either 10 or 11 people that have entered, actually. Been keeping track of it. Several people from Cageside Seats have appeared in, and then some that are just kind of randomly popping in from the random corners of YouTube. I've been trying to put the link out for the show, and well, we'll see what happens, guys. Good luck to everyone that's already entered, and good luck to everyone that's going to enter this week. For those, again, who are just joining us, this is the pack that you're getting. If you win the drawing here for our first trivia contest, you have a WrestleMania adjustable cap. It's a very nice cap, actually. I bought myself one to wear, and I've got another one here ready to go. We've got a WrestleMania program that also has some information on this year's Hall of Fame class. It's a really neat little thing. It's got the full roster for all the brands in the WWE. It's a really nice little book. It's almost a coffee table style book. It's pretty oversized, actually, so that's a nice little prize there. Also, we got a full WrestleMania poster, has all the matches from this year's card on it. It's a beautiful poster. Again, bought another one for our sports themed room that we're constructing here at QCE headquarters. And a souvenir cup. I did, in fact, pay the $11 to get an extra cup because I care about you. I care about my listeners. It's a WrestleMania souvenir cup. Got Ronda Rousey, Triple H, a couple of the other performers on it. You know, the WrestleMania logo. I mean, it's just cool to have some swag from WrestleMania coming to you live from New Orleans. So we'll do the drawing on air next week. If your name is drawn, I will be emailing you with information to get your mailing address and everything. Got a couple of people here local in Charlotte that have attempted to enter the contest, including one of my dear personal friends who did not email the correct answer. But if you're in the Charlotte area, I'll bring it to you direct. Otherwise, I'll get your mailing address and I'll get it mailed out. We'll be doing the trivia contest question here at the end of the show, so stay tuned in for that. We'll also be looking at the WWE Network Match of the Week. That's a segment we've been doing on here the last couple of episodes, and we're going to be doing it again here tonight, going all the way back to 1992 for this week's match. So very much looking forward to sharing that one with you. Of course, we have our quick hits where we talk about some random stuff from the wrestling world, either past, present, or future. But let's go ahead and get some plugs out of the way. Got a bunch of podcasts with the Cageside Seats family. I know we do have some listeners that have popped in here that are not around the Cageside Seats community. If you've never been there, check it out. Some good folks there. The daily and nightly threads in particular, full of good people. A lot of great conversation, wrestling and other talk. Just come on in, have a good time. Got a bunch of people that have podcasts right now. Just here's a few of them. Two Guys, One Sport with Chris and George. Be sure to check that one out. Of course, our good friend Vizzy's Wacky World of Wrestling. Full Metal Matt and his Ruthless Aggression podcast. That drops Friday evenings. Very good show on this past Friday on Tough Enough Season 3. He's been really doing a great job with that, so be sure to check his show out. Mox and Ambrose Alley are bringing the Violent Wrestling podcast back, so keep in touch with them on Cageside Seats. Be looking forward to seeing that one drop. Ringside Geeks with Miss Monroe and Friends, also a very popular podcast. Be sure to watch out for their new episodes. And, of course, the Godfather himself, Taker's Minion, and Doc Sinju have the Shooting the Breeze podcast every Saturday morning. That drops at 11 Eastern, 10 Eastern on the weekends with Big Four shows for their special editions. But in general, you can find them 11 a.m. Eastern, Saturday mornings. That is the Shooting the Breeze podcast. The Godfather of podcasting at Cageside Seats and a very good friend of mine, Taker's Minion. They do an excellent job. I was on there again this morning. I'm kind of the unwanted house guest that just keeps popping up. Don't bother to pay rent, but there I am. So good show. Check them out. Just hang around Cageside Seats. You'll get an awful lot of great content on a weekly basis, both from the podcasting family that we have growing and from the fan post series that we have people doing now. It's a really great time to be hanging out there, the Cageside Seats family. So shout out to them. I know a bunch of people have been really giving a lot of support to the podcasting group that's been putting out content. So a hearty thank you to everyone there listening. And just wanted to give a shout out to those that have jumped in the live stream. I love you too, Ambrose Alley. Thank you very much for that shout out. We're going to have a good show tonight, folks. So enjoy it. We're going to start off with our quick hits. Now, this is actually a very interesting topic. A very, very interesting topic that I've wanted to talk about for a little while now. And my good friend Crash Bandit, I call him Coot because Crash Bandicoot, actually did a fan post series on this very subject at Cageside Seats. I have the link in the info box down below. So if you're not frequenting that website, check that link out. Give it a read. Give it a rec, too, if you get the chance. It's an excellent fan post read. It was on the main page of the website for a while this week. But it does bring up some interesting points about Jinder Mahal, and that's where we're going to start tonight here on the last call. I am really curious to get people's opinions on Jinder Mahal and whether or not he could have worked as a world champion. I don't think it is improper to say that Jinder Mahal failed as a champion. I think that's a pretty safe thing to argue. Jinder never really made it as a champion. And it's unfortunate because, we talk about performers and not living up to expectations. We talk about performers that maybe don't have as much in-ring talent as their peers. At the end of the day, you want to be entertained by the show. You want to have a shot at being entertained by someone new. You're always looking for the new thing. You want something that really speaks to, what we're looking for in the product. And, I don't think that anyone, unless you were just a pure hater, wanted Jinder Mahal to fail. Now, with a lot of people, myself included, that never bought into Jinder Mahal as a legitimate contender. But that doesn't mean that I wanted Jinder to fail. And that's really the real source of frustration with me personally and from some other people. Is there a way that WWE could have helped Jinder succeed? I am of the opinion, and I think Crash shared this opinion quite brilliantly in his fan post. I don't believe that things were set up to work for Jinder just based on the simple fact that it was so generic. It was just such a generic bland, uninspired character that he was playing. I know wrestling is full of archetypes. I know that the evil heel foreigner is, an established wrestling trope at this point. But I think that was the problem with Jinder. In order to truly break out of the pack, you have to really excel at a particular area, especially if you're using a character that's not exactly novel or new. If you're going to use a standard archetype from wrestling history, you need to find a way to make it your own, to really stand out. I don't think Jinder had that capacity. And that's just a personal opinion. I don't think Jinder had the ability to make that role his own. It just came across as old hat. It just wasn't very inspired. Uh, that says nothing about the credibility issue either. He went from jobbing to Mojo Rawley to winning the #1 contendership in the span of a week. And then he beat Randy Orton. Now, a lot of people will point to the fact that Jinder Mahal never really won many of his title defenses in a clean fashion. Absolutely true. But there's a difference between Jinder Mahal winning the title and being treated as a serious champion and someone like Carmella, who cashes in on Charlotte when she's beaten down and is treated as a fluke. There's two very different, roles to play there. No one is going to look at Carmella as a legitimate champion until she starts beating people straight up in the middle of the ring. And if that happens, we can have that conversation about whether she's a credible champion. Jinder, from almost the outset, was treated as a credible champion by virtue of beating Randy Orton. And that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because he had never established himself on that level. It was just such a huge jump, and particularly for old school fans, long-term fans who really value the championship legacy and prestige of being champion. It really doomed him from the start. Not to say anything about, Jinder Mahal, the person, not to say that he's a bad person. He's not. I'm glad that he, as a human being, got the success that he got. But we're talking really from a fan's perspective here. And as a fan, his title run was not really acceptable. It was never really worthy of the championship. His character wasn't. His work wasn't. Some of the worst main event matches of the last 5 or 6 years were all in 2017. That Punjabi prison match with Randy Orton at, I believe it was Battleground, just an asinine match. Just terrible, terrible match. The Shinsuke Nakamura feud was dramatically underwhelming, and there was some questionable writing that got thrown in there too. And so it begs the question, if heel Jinder Mahal could not have worked, and I'm of the mind to believe that he couldn't have, he's just not talented enough, could a babyface run have worked better? Now, whether or not babyface Jinder Mahal could have gotten to the World Championship in a credible manner, that is very much open to debate. That's really in the eye of the beholder at that point. But he was going to be treated as a babyface in India. And that's really what this push was designed for. Jinder Mahal is designed to give the Indian market that WWE is breaking into last year a hero to rally around. But he was not booked as a hero. He was not a heroic character. He was a really weak babyface for the Indian fans, who I really believe saw through the attempt. And the lack of success on the Indian tour last year probably bears that out. Now, Jinder was very popular in India, but there was just very little interest in ticket sales. Ticket sales did not move after he won the title. They had to cancel one of their shows, as a matter of fact, due to lack of interest. So, maybe the fans in India saw through the attempt. Maybe they didn't. It's hard to say. But it makes more sense to me as a fan, if you're going to treat him as a babyface in one market, just book him as a babyface. Now, Jinder Mahal as evil foreign heel, that's pretty lame. I don't think anyone is really going to get interested in that. Jinder doesn't have the capacity to cut these world-bending, mind-blowing promos. Jinder's not going to wow anybody with exceptional in-ring work, especially not with people like AJ Styles on the roster. But Jinder Mahal as a babyface, that's a completely different subject. As a babyface, you're not having to carry the matches anymore. You know, it's Wrestling 101. Your heels, generally speaking, are your best in-ring workers because the heels generally control the matches. As a babyface, maybe Jinder has an easier time getting over with the crowd. You know, it's kind of funny looking at his body and his physique. You know, nobody that's coming into wrestling blind would look at this guy and think he's an underdog, but all of the fans that have been watching this guy for the last year before he got this push, he absolutely would be considered an underdog. That's really what he was. He was an underdog character. No one expected him to win that championship. They thought it was a one and done. And as soon as he won that title, people were really expecting him to drop it quickly until the India tour kind of popped up. As a babyface underdog character, he might get sympathy because nobody believes in his ability to do what he's doing. And as he starts to do it more and more, he starts to pick up these wins. He could build a groundswell of support. You may have something there. Randy Orton works better as a heel anyway. And Jinder Mahal does have some comedic timing from the three-man band era. So he does have some charisma. It's hard to see it when he's playing the evil heel foreigner character because it's just all groaning, grunting, grimacing, you know, all of these, you know, nasty faces and expressions. But maybe it could have worked. Maybe it could have worked. I don't think that Jinder Mahal is a bad worker. He's just not a particularly special worker. But that hasn't stopped Vince McMahon from making stars out of subpar workers in the past. Some of the most important people in the history of the WWE have been really bland and benign workers in the ring. So in-ring talent is not the surefire key to success. If it were, Dean Malenko would be one of the greatest stars in the history of the business. And I say that as a huge Dean Malenko fan. It's interesting to think what could have been had they gone a different direction with Jinder Mahal. If they wanted to make him a star, was turning him heel in the American market, which is their home market, and the basis for most of their business, was that a smart idea? It is an interesting question, and unfortunately, we'll never know the answer. But, you know, God bless him. Jinder got his title run, and that's a big accomplishment for a lot of people. So we'll just have to leave it up to speculation. Jinder is not the only interesting topic, not the only controversial topic that we're going to have tonight here on The Last Call. This one's a little bit more topical. If you watch SmackDown this week, we did have a big return, and there is no pun intended. It is Big Cass, formerly of Enzo and Cass, the realest guys. He returned from a knee injury. He's back on the blue brand, and it looks like he's going straight to the main event scene. He had a little backstage segment with Daniel Bryan, playing up on the height difference. Wouldn't exactly call it inspired, but then he did show up in the main event. Now, I will admit, his presence in the main event after the match was a little bit overshadowed by Nakamura having himself, pardon my language here, an orgasm hitting AJ Styles in the balls. And that is one of the great joys of SmackDown these days, is just looking at the satisfaction Nakamura takes at punching AJ Styles in the pills. It's like he never knew real happiness until he low-blowed AJ Styles. And now his happiness and AJ's balls are just tied together. So, I mean, Nakamura, God bless him. Whatever gets him happy, I guess, go for it. AJ going to be without children moving forward, so he's saving money on a vasectomy, I guess. There's nothing really much else you could say about the character. His heel turn is pretty much based on hitting AJ Styles in the groin and saying he doesn't speak English. And some very witty banter with Corey Graves on Twitter, too. Nakamura is a national treasure. So when you have Nakamura being amazing outside the ring, Big Cass's entrance into the main event scene, a little less than stellar. with The Miz on the way in next week, I think that Big Cass will probably be partnered up with him. I don't see an alliance with Nakamura. I know people saw him come out with Nakamura this particular show and thought, well, maybe he's with Nakamura. I don't see it. Not that it couldn't work. It would just be, wouldn't be optimal, let's say. If you're going to pair somebody off with Nakamura, you want somebody that can really talk, I think. And Big Cass isn't that guy. Big Cass isn't the guy that needs to be doing the talking. Big Cass is the guy that needs to be standing behind the talker looking menacing, which is why partnering up with The Miz would be absolutely the best possible use of him right now. Having him with The Miz, I think that he could be a serviceable player in the upper card. Now, Big Cass does not have the in-ring talent of his peers on SmackDown. If we're just looking at this from a pragmatic perspective, he's definitely going to be the weakest in-ring worker on a very loaded SmackDown card. As a heel, his size, his presence, he has some charisma. Obviously, he wasn't as charismatic as his tag team partner was. And so, really, he was kind of the heavy of his tag team, and now he's just kind of a heavy without a purpose. I love him in the role of a bodyguard for The Miz. I love him in that role, and I tell you why I like him in that role, too. It reminds me a little bit of the Shawn Michaels Diesel dynamic from 1993, 1994. Before Diesel kind of became, a serious singles competitor, that role as a bodyguard for Shawn, it really got him over. And I think it could get Big Cass over. Now, Miz is not the in-ring worker that Shawn Michaels is. Miz will never sniff Shawn Michaels on his best day. But The Miz is one of the most charismatic performers on SmackDown. He can talk. He has the gift of gab. The Miz can incite hatred and passion from fans in the same promo. I know a lot of people don't like The Miz, but you got to give him his props. He's one of the best when it comes to working the crowd on the microphone. Miz gets heat, and that's what Big Cass needs. He needs someone to get heat on him. And I think The Miz is the perfect person to do that. If you're not going to have Big Cass working with The Miz, then Big Cass is going to really have to step up his game. The brief exposure he had on Thursday or Tuesday with his promos, not exactly the most stellar of work. It was very generic, very bland, very boring, and that's not going to cut it because SmackDown has some very magnetic personalities and some very good talkers. Joe is a great promo. Nakamura has a certain charisma about him. Even if he's not a great promo, he's got presence. Miz is a good promo. Daniel Bryan and AJ Styles are both serviceable on the microphone, but they have a lot of fan support. Big Cass is not going to be able to coast by on mediocrity and get over on this show. There's too much talent around him. If he's on Raw, maybe he could just by virtue of Vince pushing him as hard as he could. But on SmackDown, a show that's going to be defined as much by in-ring work as it is anything, he's going to need some help. And I think The Miz is the perfect person to help him. If he's with The Miz and he's allowed to come along at his own pace, then I think Big Cass is going to be just fine in the upper card because he's got an opportunity on SmackDown to really make a mark for himself. But as always, just the same song, second verse, WWE has to do right by him. If he doesn't do right by him, he's going to get into trouble. And so that's my thoughts on Big Cass. We'll just have to wait and see what happens there. Want to go ahead and say thank you to everyone in the live stream right now. Very hearty good evening to you. Welcome to the live stream. Hope you're enjoying yourself. Going on the list of the quick hits here, got a very interesting topic that was brought up today during the Shooting to Breach podcast. Now, if you have not listened to Taker's Minion or Doc, their show on Saturday mornings is tremendous. The best podcast that I've listened to all week, quite frankly. And I'm not just saying that because I was on them this morning. In general, they have an amazing podcast. And I would hardly recommend you check that out. But we had a conversation this morning about WrestleMania 34 and the Greatest Royal Rumble. And I wanted to expand upon that conversation here tonight because it's a very interesting topic. And if you didn't listen today, the gist of the conversation was relating to the greatest Royal Rumble event kind of overshadowing WrestleMania 34. And that's really what I want to talk about here tonight. Will the greatest Royal Rumble event in Saudi Arabia this coming Friday make WrestleMania 34 irrelevant? And I got to tell you, as someone who attended WrestleMania, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who was in the Superdome watching this show live 2 weeks ago. I got to say that it will. I got to say that it will. I really and truly do believe that this greatest Royal Rumble show is going to overshadow WrestleMania and make WrestleMania 34 irrelevant. And I say that because look at the picture of WrestleMania 34. What are the big enduring memories of WrestleMania 34? You had the Ronda Rousey match. You had Shinsuke Nakamura turning heel. And you had Brock Lesnar walking out with the title against all expectations. Now, obviously, Ronda Rousey won't be in Jeddah, and people have talked about the issues surrounding female performers in Saudi Arabia. We don't have to cover that here again. That's out there in the ether. My thoughts are well known. Pragmatically speaking, good on Vince for making millions, but don't hold a PR high ground like you're some progressive company. If you're going to take the money, take the cost with it. Be that as it may, without Ronda, the two title matches coming up in Saudi Arabia, along with the Greatest Royal Rumble match itself, are going to be the big draws. The 50-man Rumble event would appear to be for a trophy of some sort. There are images of a trophy that have been circulating. I'm not sure if those are legit, if those were Photoshopped, but I'm pretty sure the winner of the Rumble itself gets a trophy. I don't think there's a title shot on the line. Maybe we'll get clarification on that this week. But the two title matches are very much important in the grand scheme of things for WWE. And they're both rematches from WrestleMania 34. And this is the kicker. They're both matches from WrestleMania 34, and they're both matches that could have different results from what we saw in New Orleans. Now, that is the key here. Roman Reigns could very easily walk out of Saudi Arabia with the Universal Championship. Now, it's a dangerous thing to say we all expect him to walk out with the title because we all expected him to walk out of the title in New Orleans. So you can never say never when WWE is involved. You don't know what Vince's mindset's going to be when he arrives in Saudi Arabia. Brock Lesnar could very easily retain the title. As far as I'm concerned, Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar in a steel cage, that's a 50-50 proposition. Until Roman actually wins the title, that's just how it's going to be. Because you never know what's going to happen with his matches. But if Roman Reigns does, in fact, walk out of Saudi Arabia with the title, it means, basically, that Vince was waiting on a more favorable environment. Or, vice versa, he could have been waiting to give the Saudis a big moment. Maybe that was part of the deal. Or maybe he just wanted to give a foreign audience something they don't see very often, which is a WWE title change. To my recollection, it's only happened once before in the entire history of the company. Last year in Manchester, when AJ Styles beat Jinder Mahal for the WWE Championship. Whatever the reason that Roman would win the title in Saudi Arabia, it still reflects very poorly on the decision not to put the title on him in New Orleans when everybody was expecting it. WrestleMania is the showcase of the Immortals for a reason. It's the biggest show of the year, and it's been the biggest show of the year for over 30 years now. At no point have any of the other big four shows ever come close to matching the pomp and circumstance of WrestleMania. We talk about the big four shows with a sense of reverence, especially longtime fans, because the big four shows used to be all you got. You know, for several years there, it was WrestleMania, SummerSlam, Survivor Series, and the Rumble. And that was your year. Those are the shows you built to. Maybe the occasional Saturday night's main event, but Other than that, you were working towards those big four shows. But even during the era of the big four, SummerSlam never measured up to WrestleMania. The Royal Rumble never measured up to WrestleMania. You could argue very, very loosely that the 87 Survivor Series tried to measure up to WrestleMania. It didn't get there. It was a very interesting show, and I recommend you go and watch it if you've never watched it. We're going to be talking about that show in particular Monday during the Connoisseurs of Wrestling podcast, which I'll get into a little bit later here. The 87 Survivor Series tried to measure up a little bit to WrestleMania 3, but you're not going to measure up to WrestleMania. It just wasn't possible. And by 88, it was clearly a secondary show. So no show has ever measured up to WrestleMania. No show has ever been treated as more important than WrestleMania. And for wrestling fans that value continuity, especially in a company that loves to shake things up from time to time, that lack of continuity can be really frustrating, which is why we always hold on to the big events. We know that the Rumble is in January. We know that WrestleMania is at the end of March or the beginning of April. And that WrestleMania show is the end of the year. That's where all the big angles should finish, and that's where all our new angles should begin. It's both the finish line and the starting point for the year to come. That the night after WrestleMania. Now, I made a point earlier, and it was kind of glossed over because we were running out of time. Newer fans, they don't know what a true WrestleMania is. And what I mean by that, when I say you don't know what a true WrestleMania is, the last 5 to 10 years of WrestleManias, you have the grandeur, the splendor, the amazing sets, the production values, you have the pyro. One of the only times you get a special set now during the year. You get all the big matches. WrestleMania was very much about closure and very much about big moments. And over the last 5 to 10 years, even before that to an extent, WrestleMania was about getting the best matches on the card. Now it's about getting everyone a payday. One of the greatest matches I've ever seen in my life, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Macho Man Randy Savage for the Intercontinental title. That match would probably never happen on today's WrestleMania. Simply because it's not about getting those classic matches or building up those classic storylines anymore. You know, at least 3/4 of this year's card, maybe even more than that, wasn't even settled until, 3 weeks before the show. Some of the feuds that were culminating at WrestleMania hadn't even begun before Elimination Chamber. And that's just the price you pay for the way things are set up now. You have a live episode of Raw and SmackDown every week. 5 hours of main roster programming to go through every single week without fail. You're just not going to have the same opportunity to see a classic WrestleMania filled with classic blow-off matches. And that's not to say that all WrestleManias were filled with nothing but blow-offs. One of my favorite shows of all time is WrestleMania 6, and there's a load of filler on there. Let's not pretend the Hart Foundation and the Bolsheviks had anything great going on. But there's just something that is lost from the WrestleManias of years gone by and the WrestleManias that we get now. But even in its diminished capacity, WrestleMania is still the hallmark of the year. It's still more important than the Rumble. It's still more important than SummerSlam. It's still more important than any other show. We talk about takeovers and how they kind of overshadow the big four counterparts that they run up against in terms of in-ring quality. But it's still the big four shows that we look forward to. I was looking forward to going to TakeOver in New Orleans. I wanted to see Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa. That's one of the reasons I bought tickets. But what motivated me to go to New Orleans and drive 700 miles in a single fucking day, it was not to go to TakeOver, it was to go to WrestleMania. WrestleMania was the draw. TakeOver was the icing on the cake. WrestleMania is an institution. You don't screw around with institutions, because once they're ruined, they're ruined. And I'm telling you right now, by delaying a title change at WrestleMania in order to do it in Saudi Arabia, intentionally ruining a guy in Roman Reigns, delaying his title win so that you could do it in Saudi Arabia for whatever your reasons are, that is a very, very dangerous precedent. Because what you're saying to the fans is that what happened in New Orleans doesn't really matter. If Brock Lesnar drops the title to Roman Reigns, New Orleans no longer matters. It's just a speed bump, a roadblock. And the big moment came in Saudi Arabia. And it doesn't matter if it's in Saudi Arabia or Japan or even in Toledo, Ohio. It doesn't matter that it's in Saudi Arabia. I think that's where Takers and I might disagree a bit. It's not just that it's in Saudi Arabia. Now, there's plenty of controversy around the location beyond this. But even if they had the greatest Royal Rumble in Saginaw, Michigan, you're still putting on a massive show right after WrestleMania that's going to overshadow WrestleMania. A 50-man Royal Rumble, a loaded card, and 2 return matches from New Orleans. You could see at least one title change, and it's very possible that Shinsuke Nakamura could win the WWE Championship. He's on fire right now. It could happen. What happens if Nakamura wins a title? I would say most people, majority of the fans, thought he was walking out of New Orleans with the championship. Virtually everyone thought Roman Reigns was. What does it say if your 2 title matches in New Orleans are stunted because you're trying to get to a more important show? I don't think you can undersell the damage that could do. It's not cheap to go to WrestleMania. I spent $600 on tickets for our group. That's just the tickets. And they weren't that good a seat. People that are sitting on floor level, you could be spending upwards of $1,000 with more than 2 people going. It's very possible. And in these big stadium shows, that's pretty much what you got to spend just to get a good seat. But you've got hotels, food, travel costs. Not everybody can drive in. Some have to fly. You're talking about trips that run in the thousands of dollars. That's not cheap. People pay thousands of dollars to go to WrestleMania because it's WrestleMania. And if you take away the specialness of WrestleMania by rendering it completely worthless, because you've got a big show coming up in 3 weeks where your big title changes are going to happen instead, who's going to want to go to WrestleMania? You pay the extra price because of the spectacle of WrestleMania. I am thankful that I got to go to WrestleMania. But I'm not going to pay $600 to go sit outside in New Jersey next year if I know that in 3 weeks there's going to be an even more important show where you're likely to see the titles change hands. I would rather just sit at home and watch it on the network and treat it as any other show than go through the hassle of going there live. Because once you've experienced the spectacle for yourself, it's not just about the spectacle. Now you have to have a good card. The spectacle of WrestleMania is amazing. And it can make your experience really worthwhile. But you need a good card. You're asking fans to sit for 7 hours. 7 hours or longer. I think the final total for us, we were in our seats for about 8. Between waiting on the show to start and sitting there after, letting some of the crowds file out. 8 hours we sat there. That's a long time for people to be uncomfortable in a big stadium. It's a mass of humanity. It's not easy to get around with so many people. If you're going to sit there for that long, you want a good card. You don't want to watch matches that are just setups for the next show. That's not what WrestleMania is all about. And I think absolutely there's a very real possibility that the Greatest Royal Rumble could overshadow WrestleMania 34 here. And if you do that, you're in real trouble. Because WrestleMania is one of the few institutions left in the WWE that people treat as being special. Once you take away the specialness of WrestleMania and you turn it into just any other show, that's a bad thing. It's a really bad thing. But be that as it may, they are running the show, and we will have a full lineup for the show this coming Thursday on the Queen City Express podcast. Ryan Saya will be back with me. We'll go over the card. We'll lay it all out. The start time, if I am not mistaken, is 12 p.m., noon this coming Friday. Special start time because they're overseas, obviously. Friday, April 27th at noon. The start time for the Greatest Royal Rumble. At last check, this show was supposed to be 5 hours without a pre-show. So pre-show may push it up to 6 hours. So here again, you've got a show that's WrestleMania length with WrestleMania rematches on it and quite a massive stage. It's funny, the leak design for the WrestleMania 34 stage turned out to be the stage design for the Greatest Royal Rumble. So they're definitely going all out for it. Kudos to Vince McMahon. He got his money for the shows. It's a 10-year partnership. Whether or not they continue to do the Greatest Royal Rumble show moniker moving forward or not is to be determined. And I'm guessing that the dates on these shows could be variable as well. Maybe the next year's show will be in August or something. Could see the greatest SummerSlam or the greatest WrestleMania card. You never know. But it's an interesting show, even if it is a frustrating show for a lot of fans that went to WrestleMania. But we'll cover that on Thursday. I do want to kind of pigeonhole, or not pigeonhole, kind of dovetail maybe into another topic that's a little bit germane to what we were just speaking on about the WrestleMania experience. I was sitting here doing a little bit of thinking tonight before we went on the air with this podcast, and I was thinking back on some of the most fun I've had at a wrestling show. And I wanted to pose this question to people that are in the live stream that have been in the chat. And again, thank you for all that you've been listening here tonight. Live events versus pay-per-view events. And we can throw TV events in here too if you want. I'm interested to know how many people prefer to go to a live event over those that prefer to go to a TV event. Now, this may sound like a really weird question, but when you really stop and think about it, there are some pros and cons to going to television tapings or pay-per-views. Particularly television tapings, especially these days when you're taping material for other shows. Those TV tapings can be pretty long and drawn out. Raw's already 3 hours, so you're sitting there for quite a while in the arena, even for a standard Raw. Now, the match quality on television has gone up tremendously since the brand extension. It's up on 205 Live over the last few months. It's been up on SmackDown. It's up on Raw. But you can sit through some really awful Raws. There were some really awful shows on the go-home stretch to WrestleMania. And there could be some awful shows in the near future. Raw has some work to do for that roster. So you have to balance out, the pros and cons of attending a television taping. For a pay-per-view event, it's all about cost. Tickets are more expensive. If you like the storylines that you're getting, that's good. But generally speaking, you have to buy your tickets in advance. At least for pay-per-views, they generally sell out a little bit quicker than TV tapings do. So it's a little bit more risky to wait. You're kind of taking a gamble on pay-per-views. TV tapings these days, you can generally find tickets up to the day of the show. They don't really sell out very much anymore, so you have a little bit more flexibility. With live events, it's never really about the car that you get. You know the people that are going to be on the tour, basically. So you can buy those tickets whenever, too. Live events are nowhere near as important as TV tapings, and they're not as important as pay-per-views. But I've had more fun at live events I've been to than I have at some of the recent TV episodes I've been to. Now, I've been to about 13 shows total in my entire life, and that's going all the way back to 1990. The 1990 house show that I went to, it was actually, if I'm not mistaken, one of the first shows that the WWE ran in Charlotte. Now, they didn't run it in the new Charlotte Coliseum. They ran it over at the Independence Arena, which is the old Charlotte Coliseum. If you're a longtime Crockett fan and you ever hear them talking about the Charlotte Coliseum, it's the Independence Arena, now the Bojangles Coliseum, so-called because it was off of Independence. But I'll never forget that show. Dusty Rhodes and Macho Man Randy Savage wrestled. Andre the Giant was there. Bret Hart was there. Demolition was there. Jake Roberts and Ted DiBiase were also there. It was a live show. It had no real bearing on any of the storylines that were going on, but it was fun. We attended a live event in 2015, and this was just nothing but the dregs of the roster at that point. The four biggest stars we had were Roman Reigns, Sheamus, Paige, and Charlotte Flair. And everything else was basically enhancement level matches. We had an R-Truth match and a Goldust match. And I'm thinking we had the Shining Stars at one point, wrestling some local jobbers. It was just, there was nothing going on for 90% of that show. But the live events are so much more laid back and so much more casual. I had more fun at the live event in 2015 than I did going to Raw in 2007, where we got to see Ric Flair wrestle Randy Orton in the main event. I've been to 3 pay-per-view events now, if we're including TakeOver as a pay-per-view event or a network special. Went to Vengeance in 2006 and had a good time. Went to WrestleMania this year and had a mixed time. TakeOver was phenomenal. But I'm interested to see what other people think. Maybe it's a good conversation over at Cageside Seats in the nightly thread tonight or here in the chat. Do you have a preference between live events or pay-per-views? Which are better? I got to be honest with you. If you have a chance to go to a Big Four show and you've never been, I would say the pay-per-views are the way to go. But if you're looking for a way to have a good time, I would be tempted to say live events are probably your better bet. I would rather go to a live event than a TV taping these days. And it's simply from an entertainment perspective. You may get a good TV show, you may get a bad TV show, but you very rarely get a bad house show. I went to TakeOver in New Orleans, and that was one of the greatest shows I've ever attended. But the NXT Live event that I went to in 2016 in Concord, that was amazing on its own. I almost had more fun at the NXT Live event in April of 2016 at a proverbial rodeo arena than I did in New Orleans at the Superdome. That says a lot. There's not as many people there, but the people are generally kinder. They're generally nicer. There's more families at live events. You don't have to worry about drunken fools like we did down at the Superdome. There is something to be said about the live event experience. Now, the live event experience, as a rule, is generally a laid-back, casual atmosphere, but it really does depend on where you're watching the show. And that's our final point on the quick hits tonight. And there wasn't nothing quick about it. A venue does not mean nearly what it used to in pro wrestling. If you're a longtime fan, particularly in the WWE, but even the other territories, You used to be able to watch shows and tell the building that they were in just from the look of the shows. I dare you to get on the network, go into the classics section, the classic footage that WWE has in their vault. You'll see a building with this orangey yellow carpet, and I got a really rinky-dink electronic scoreboard up on one of the promenades. Longtime fans, they could see that, and within 2 seconds, they recognize that's the Boston Garden. We remember the visual of the microphone being lowered from the ceiling down to Howard Finkel with that big yellow cover on it. You don't even have to read the MSG to know that's Madison Square Garden. You can tell from the wide shots that they do of the crowd that it's MSG. You could tell by the ring that they were in the Philadelphia Spectrum or the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto. And it was one of the coolest things, too, if you're a longtime fan. The sound of the ring in Chicago at the Rosemont Horizon was different from any other ring that they had. It's so weird. The Rosemont Horizon used to sound like some demented sound effects artist went back in post-production and just added bangs and booms to it. Go on the network and watch the WrestleMania 2 portion from Chicago's Rosemont Horizon. That tag team match, every time that Dynamite Kid's his feet, it's like there's just some extra spring in that mat. They're just bouncing all around. It's really kind of fun, actually. It kind of adds to the ambiance of the Chicago portion of that show. But that's what used to be so great. You could recognize buildings, even some of the old studios. You know, you could recognize the studios down in Atlanta where they tape World Championship Wrestling, or the Sportatorium in Dallas. You could recognize Allentown and the WWF loops. The AWA had their recognizable buildings, especially in the 80s on the ESPN. It seemed that every show was taped from Showboat Casino. You know, that's lost today because of the basic look that all the shows have for WWE. Think about some of the great venues in wrestling history. And that's going to close out our quick hit segment tonight. I want to look at the 5 best cities for pro wrestling, and particularly the 5 best arenas. Now, there have been articles about this written before. There's been discussions. I would challenge anyone that's listening in, very much challenge them to write this fan post and present these rankings, because I think that they would have a wonderful discussion with people that are trying to prove them wrong. So if you're listening in on this and you're at Cageside Seats, I challenge somebody to write this article. The 5 most important venues, the 5 best venues for wrestling. I sat there and I thought about this for a little bit. And I have my 5. Now, my 5 are very much my opinion. It's a very much subjective topic. But I also think there's some merit to this. And I'm going to present my 5, and by all means, present yours in the chat. Or we could talk about it at Cageside. I don't think that any list could be complete when you're talking about the 5 best cities for pro wrestling in North America without talking about Boston. The Boston Garden is one of the most unique venues that you will see when you go back and look in the vault at some of the old school wrestling. Now, Boston as a city, I wouldn't say that it was their A-town, or one of their A-towns even. There really weren't that many big shows for Boston. To my knowledge, they didn't have a big 4 show in Boston until the 1993 Survivor Series, I believe. Was it in 93 or 94? I'm wanting to say 1993 they had Survivor Series in Boston. But that was really the first big show in Boston on that level until they would get WrestleMania 14. So it's not that Boston had these huge super shows. It was just something about the aesthetic in Boston. Just something about the ambiance of the Boston Garden. It just looked like a classic wrestling venue. And there were some important matches that took place in Boston Garden. One of the biggest matches off the top of my head, and one of the most indirectly important matches from the 1980s, the Intercontinental title match between Tito Santana and Randy Savage, took place in the Boston Garden. It's funny, as a longtime fan, you just remember these things. I couldn't remember my wife's birthday, Harley, but I can remember where Tito Santana lost his title. That's probably why I'm divorced now, but be that as it may, that was a huge match for the WWF at that time. It made Macho Man Randy Savage a legit upper card performer. He had kind of been this whirlwind force, this force of nature up until this point. But beating Tito Santana at a time when Tito Santana was, one of the top 3 or 4 performers in the company. In 1986, you had Orndorff, Hogan, Andre, and then really you had Tito as the Intercontinental Champion. Beating Tito Santana in Boston, that was a very important deal. It launched the title run of Macho Man Randy Savage, one of the greatest Intercontinental Championship runs the company would ever see. Made him a superstar. It also retroactively became the starting point for probably one of the greatest referee angles they've ever run with Dangerous Danny Davis. And I say that having watched him at Survivor Series 87 yesterday on the network. So it's kind of fun to go back. If you ever want to see someone just get the shit kicked out of them, like if you just want to enjoy someone getting mauled in the ring, go back and watch some of those shows from 1987, particularly when Danny Davis is involved. Nobody was taking a better shit kicking in 1987 than Danny Davis. Davey Boy Smith, Tombstone Paul drived him at WrestleMania 3, and it looked like it damn near killed him. It wasn't just, the Undertaker style, drop to your knees. This was a jump up and spike their ass in the mat pile driver. And it was just glorious to watch Danny just get the crap kicked out of him because he was that hateable at that time. He was a tremendous heel. But in any event, the Macho Man Randy Savage title win in Boston, a big match. Roddy Piper and Bruno Sammartino had an amazing cage match in Boston. One of the most underrated matches on the Inside the Steel Cage VHS tape that I can't praise enough. It's on the network. You can go and find it. It's kind of interesting, actually. Used to rent that tape every year on my birthday from Blockbuster Video. And I'm about to have a birthday here in 2 days. And so I may have to watch that on the network, just to kind of relive some old memories. But, Boston was a tremendous venue. And the Boston Garden would probably be on my list of the top 5. But I couldn't rate it in good conscience above the Rosemont Horizon. I talked a minute ago about the Rosemont and the rings and how they were so, loud sounding. That's another classic venue that just has a certain aesthetic about it that just makes you really enjoy the product. And now there is a lot of history for wrestling in the Rosemont. The first ever wrestling pay-per-view. First pay-per-view in history. A lot of people don't know this. The first pay-per-view in wrestling history was not WrestleMania 1. WrestleMania 1 was not a pay-per-view event. It was on closed circuit. The first pay-per-view event took place later that year from Chicago in the Rosemont Horizon. The Rosemont Horizon, I believe, now is the Allstate Arena. So that might be, if you're not a longtime fan, you may be wondering where the hell the Rosemont Horizon is, but this is the Allstate Arena in Chicago. It's where WrestleMania 22 was held. Hopefully that'll provide a little bit of clarification here. But the Wrestling Classic in 1985 was actually the first pay-per-view ever held by the WWE. And it came from Chicago. One of the 3 locations for WrestleMania 2, the Rosemont Horizon, mentioned a little bit ago. Headlined by the best match on the entire night, in my opinion, the British Bulldogs and the Dream Team. It's a good segue to give a shout-out to the family, to Johnny V. Johnny V, of course, Johnny Valiant passed away during WrestleMania weekend a couple weeks ago. This was his team, the Dream Team. Brutus Beefcake and Greg Valentine lost the tag titles to the British Bulldogs, who had Captain Lou in their corner and Ozzy Osbourne. But the NFL WWE Battle Royal took place in Chicago. So honestly, the WrestleMania 2 show itself was a really underrated show overall. A lot of people kind of shit on that show, I think. The Chicago portion and the first part of the Los Angeles show, they're really actually quite good for that. One to watch if you've never seen it. It's really fascinating. But the Rosemont Horizon was a very important venue for the WWE all through the 80s and 90s. The 1989 Survivor Series took place at the Rosemont Horizon. Of course, we mentioned just a second ago WrestleMania 22 from the Rosemont Horizon as well. So it's had multiple WrestleManias held there. First wrestling pay-per-view ever. But more than that, more than the importance and the history behind the venue, it's just a fun place to watch a wrestling show. It looks good on TV. It looks like a classic wrestling arena, especially in the 80s when they had their own ring that they would set up there. It just looked different. It sounded different. It felt unique. Rosemont Horizon would be on my list at number 4. But I am from the Carolinas. I am a Crockett fan at heart. I cannot in good conscience produce a list that does not include at least one arena from the Crockett territory. And a lot of people would probably expect me to pick the Greensboro Coliseum. And you would be correct. It is the Greensboro Coliseum at number 3. First Starrcade here, obviously a big deal. Several of the Starrcade shows in the 80s were held in Greensboro. It was the centerpiece of the Crockett territory, the Cadillac of NWA territories. And it was a big market for WCW in the 90s as well. But what makes Greensboro so special is not Starrcade necessarily. That's a big part of it. But really, for longtime fans, Greensboro was honestly right neck and neck with St. Louis in terms of being a mecca for NWA action. There were really 4 big cities in the 70s and into the 80s for the NWA. And they kind of revolved around the centerpieces of the biggest 4 territories. You had Tampa for Eddie Graham in Florida, St. Louis, which was kind of the capital of the NWA, at least up until the 80s. You had the Omni in Atlanta, which the Omni, of course, if you listen to a lot of NWA wrestlers, they would say is their favorite venue. And then you have the Greensboro Coliseum. One of the biggest shows that was ever held in Greensboro was not Starrcade. It actually happened about 6 months before Starrcade. There was a tag team match that was booked. Sergeant Slaughter and Don Kernodle defended the tag titles for the Crockett territory against Ricky the Dragon Steamboat and Jay Youngblood. This match was so hot in Greensboro. Now, Greensboro Coliseum, I know Greensboro doesn't have the cachet of a Charlotte, but the Greensboro Coliseum, where it's positioned, it had an unnaturally large arena. This is one of the things that a lot of people don't recognize about the Greensboro Coliseum. That building could seat upwards of 23,000 people. It's a massive building out in the middle of BFE. But they did it that way because the ACC tournament needed kind of a neutral site. And Greensboro was pretty much the geographic center of the Atlantic Coast Conference, and so they built a big basketball arena in Greensboro, and the wrestling companies just kind of moved in and started running shows there. But in 1983, this tag match, and this tag match alone, drew so much business for Jim Crockett and Mid-Atlantic Wrestling. They not only sold out the Greensboro Coliseum, 23,000 people paid, But they turned away another 10,000 people at the gate the day of the show. And this show was barely promoted for about 2 weeks beforehand. We're not talking about a WrestleMania 34 where you know it's going to happen a year in advance. 23,000 people in Greensboro, North Carolina on a random Wednesday night in 1983. Another 8 to 10,000 people turned away. It got so bad at the Greensboro Coliseum complex down in Greensboro, they had to get the police to go on the radio and tell people, if you don't already have tickets, stay away. Because it was a maelstrom of traffic and human bodies trying to get to the Greensboro Coliseum. I love my hometown. I love Charlotte, North Carolina, but I could never, in good conscience, put Charlotte ahead of Greensboro. Greensboro, if you didn't live in Greensboro or you're not from the Crockett territory, you just don't know how big wrestling was in Greensboro. And that's why it gets number 3 on my list. I would love to have it higher. But there's 2 towns and 2 arenas that I could not put it ahead of. And one of them might surprise you. I'm going to throw a curveball here. There are a number of big venues. There are a number of smaller venues that have a lot of cachet too. You know, the Fort Hesterly Armory in Tampa, Sportatorium in Dallas. And I thought very long and hard about putting the Omni in Atlanta on this list. The Omni was the site of some amazing shows before they tore it down. WCW used to run the Omni a lot until they got hot in the 90s, and then they kind of transitioned into the Georgia Dome. They would always run those big Georgia Dome Nitro episodes. But the Omni in Atlanta was the centerpiece for Georgia Championship Wrestling, and then it became the centerpiece for WCW, even more so than Charlotte, I think, in the 90s. But if we're talking about wrestling cities, not just the venues themselves, I cannot in good conscience leave off Memphis, Tennessee, and the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis. That's number 2 on my list. Now, that pains me as a Crockett-era mark to have to put Memphis ahead of Greensboro. But I don't believe that we really appreciate what Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett did in Memphis all those years. Jerry Lawler is one of the biggest stars in wrestling history. And Jerry Lawler's career, 95, 96% of it was spent in one town. The Memphis territory would tour week to week in places like Lexington, Louisville, Evansville, Indiana, Tupelo, Mississippi. But every week, they would hold a big show in Memphis. Week after week, year on year, they were in Memphis, running these big shows at the Mid-South Coliseum. Jerry Lawler sold out that building, 8,000 to 12,000 people, every week for over a decade and a half. You're talking about the same fans paying money for tickets week in and week out, decades on end, because the wrestling was that hot in Memphis. Memphis is a very unusual territory if you go back and look at it. Jim Cornette had a famous analogy one time or not even an analogy, it was just kind of how they used to do business. They could take a guy off the street, put a mask on him, give him 3 wins, and he would be ready to pop a house with Jerry Lawler at the Mid-South Coliseum. One of the most famous wrestling angles in history took place there. Andy Kaufman, famous comedian in the 70s. Really interesting character all his own. He had the famous Intergender Wrestling Championship angle that he was working. big Hollywood star, very controversial star in his era. He wanted to do a wrestling angle. Vince McMahon Sr. turned him down, but Jerry Lawler brought him in to Memphis. And Andy Kaufman and Jerry Lawler ran a big angle. And some of that material was on a documentary about Andy Kaufman's life that Comedy Central either produced or aired years ago. This is back in the 90s now. But if you can get on YouTube and find some of those Andy Kaufman, Jerry Lawler segments, that is some tremendous stuff. Andy Kaufman nearly got himself shot getting so much heel heat, just making fun of people in Memphis. But they were drawing those kind of crowds week after week for years. It wasn't just having a Hollywood star come in to pop a house. Jerry Lawler homesteaded in Memphis for over 2 decades. He made a viable territory off one big town, and he became a wrestling legend by virtue of being the king of Memphis. There's some classic wrestling that happened there. Of course, one of the big matches, one of the more infamous matches maybe, with the quote-unquote invasion of the Macho Man Randy Savage and Leap Atlantic Poffo. They have been running an outlaw promotion kind of counter to Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett. ICW was what it was called. You can get on YouTube. They have some of their footage from their shows. Randy Savage's father was running opposition to Jarrett and Lawler. There's some matches where Savage and Poffo were wrestling the Rock and Roll Express, and they hit a pile driver on Ricky Morton outside on a wooden table. Now, you want to talk about death. That was a murder, death, kill move for Tennessee. A pile driver was the end. Kind of had the same cachet as the DDT would in the WWF later on in the 80s. But there were some tremendous matches with Randy Savage in Memphis. The AWA World Title match between Kurt Hennig, the future Mr. Perfect, and Jerry Lawler took place in Memphis. There was the empty arena match between Terry Funk and Jerry Lawler, the first of its kind, and served as the inspiration for the empty arena match that Rock and Mick Foley would have in 1999 on Halftime Heat during the Super Bowl that year. Memphis was a very influential town and a very important town. And it may have been its own little pocket, little isolated area. May not have held the same national standard as Dallas did or New Orleans with Bill Watts. May not have been as important as Atlanta or San Francisco. Of course, you could include the Cow Palace on this list. But in general, I honestly believe the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis, that's one of the best wrestling towns there ever was. To this day, they still do big shows in Memphis because those crowds are still rabid for their wrestling. Jerry Lawler is still an institution in Memphis all these years later. That's my number 2 town on the list. But every list has to have a number 1. And of course, there's no real shock at what's going on number 1 here. It's got to be Madison Square Garden. Don't even have to, really defend this choice. Madison Square Garden is the mecca for professional wrestling. Some of the biggest shows of all time took place there. WrestleMania, synonymous with Madison Square Garden. Held 3 of them over the years. Some of the best SummerSlam shows took place at Madison Square Garden. Of course, the very first in 1988 went down there. 1991, one of the most fun WWF shows you'll ever see. If you've never seen SummerSlam 1991, watch it at some point this weekend. It is worth a watch. It's just fun. It's just a fun show from start to finish. Of course, if you were watching in the Attitude Era, SummerSlam 98, one of the best shows of that era of wrestling. Main event of Steve Austin and The Undertaker, the Highway to Hell match. Of course, there were several Royal Rumbles that took place at Madison Square Garden, 2000 being one of the best. 2008 was no slob either. If I'm not mistaken, every single Big Four show has emanated at least one time from Madison Square Garden. Now, WWE doesn't run many shows there anymore. They've kind of taken a liking to the Barclays Center, I think because of cost effectiveness, really. But Madison Square Garden's place in history will never be understated. You can never forget MSG when you're talking about the most important wrestling venues. You know, if you look back at the WWF territory, we're talking in the 60s and 70s, into the early 80s, before they went national. There are certain arenas that are synonymous with the WWF. Well, that was unfortunate. I had an internet outage here locally. It's kind of the problem doing these podcast live streams, unfortunately. Internet outages kind of crop up out of nowhere. Uh, if you are still with us, thank you very much for sticking by. Obviously, the show has a little bit of a break. If you are still here, hopefully back now. Not exactly sure where the show itself left off. Madison Square Garden was the number one venue on the list. Um, Technical difficulties, what can you do? Well, we are closing in on the end of the show anyway. And thank you very much for those that stuck with us on the stream. Madison Square Garden, I'm not sure if this point got across before the internet dropped. You just can't talk about WWE without talking about Madison Square Garden. Even though they don't run the shows there very often anymore, it's still one of the all-time great venues, one of the classic venues. But I would definitely recommend anyone that's got an interest in writing articles. I would love to see your lists over at Cageside Seats tonight. The 5 best venues for wrestling. And, I think this is definitely more of an old school topic because the venues themselves, they don't matter as much today. But there's a lot of venues that you could touch on. The Georgia Dome in Atlanta. Of course, you could look at the LA Sports Arena in Los Angeles. That's a big venue. You could even expand it to international if you'd like. Talk about the Tokyo Dome or some of the other great venues for All Japan. You could look at venues in Europe too. Anything you want, really. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. But, especially in the old days, the wrestling venues themselves had as much character as some of the wrestlers that you saw on TV. And so it's an interesting discussion just to kind of look back and think about all of the classic venues. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I know that we've been having some chatting going on here in the live chats. Again, I really apologize for dropping out there momentarily. But I'm going to be looking forward to go back through the chat and read some of your comments during the show here. It's kind of interesting. I call it the quick hits. It's supposed to be 5 little brief points that we talk about. And tonight went about an hour and a half. So not exactly quick hits, but hey, I hope you've enjoyed the show thus far. I did promise you the ultimate QCE trivia contest challenge. We've been doing this the last couple of weeks on the last call. This is your final chance to enter. And if you missed the instructions at the start of the show, I'll go over it again here. Biff Kensington 2018 at gmail.com. That's where you send the answers in. I'm going to give you the trivia question for this week here momentarily. If you get the correct answer, you're entered into the contest. Next week, live on the air, we'll be having our drawing. We've got a WrestleMania prize pack, about $50 worth of souvenirs from the Superdome in New Orleans that we're going to be giving to one lucky winner. We'll be holding these trivia contests sporadically throughout the year. The next drawing will be taking place in late June. Got a special prize lined up for June. So that's when the next contest will be taking place. Going to just kind of encourage people to check out the show. It's been a great night so far. I've seen a bunch of people in the live stream. Thank you very much for streaming with us. Just kind of a thank you for checking out the show. It's a pleasure to be doing this. It's a pleasure to be talking with everybody here tonight. So here we go. This is the last chance to enter. If you go back into our channel here on YouTube, our shows are clearly marked last call. That's where you'll find these trivia questions. You can answer any of the trivia questions we've posed up until this week. There's 2 other trivia questions in the archives on this channel that you can go dig out if you'd like. But all of these questions, all of these answers can be found, generally speaking, on the network. And if not on the network, you can definitely look them up online. But here we go. This is a question that I think is going to be near and dear to a lot of old school fans' hearts. And it's tied into a Royal Rumble match. We've got the greatest Royal Rumble coming up in Saudi Arabia. And so I wanted to pose a Rumble-themed question to kind of commemorate the show coming up. One of the most interesting Royal Rumble shows that they've ever run was the 1990 edition of the Royal Rumble. Now, this was particularly important because this was where you first got the showdown between Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. This was kind of the launching point for the angle that would culminate in the Toronto Sky Dome at WrestleMania 6 that got Warrior the championship and kind of ended the golden age of the WWE. So the Rumble in 1990 is a very instrumental part in getting the company to that point where they put the title on the Ultimate Warrior. It's a famous scene in the Rumble match itself with Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior all alone in the ring. They crisscross, they clothesline each other. Eventually, the Barbarian comes out when both men are laid out. He starts attacking both of them. And then the Warrior is dumped, and Hulk Hogan goes on to win the match. Here's your trivia question this week. I want the final 4 participants that were in the ring in the 1990 Royal Rumble match. Not the final 4 entrants. I want the last 4 performers that were in the ring. So I want the final 3 men eliminated, and I want the winner. Now, I've already given you the winner. Hulk Hogan won the match. There's one right there for you. I want the other 3 men that were in the ring last with him. I will give you a hint. One of them have been mentioned on this show. And that's the last hint I'll give you. It's a very famous match, easy to find. Go search it out on the WWE Network. Give the whole match a watch. It's really a good Rumble. One of the best of the early Rumbles that they did. It's not quite as good as 92, but it's definitely up there. Give me the last 4 participants in the 1990 Royal Rumble match. Email the correct answer, biffkensington2018@gmail.com. And that's all you got to do. You are entered into the contest. I have 10 or 11 people that are in line. I'm wanting to get 15 or 16. If I can get 15 or 16 people into this contest, I'm a happy man. Let's make it happen, guys. If you haven't already entered the contest here tonight, definitely do so. It's an easy thing to do. It's really just my way of saying thanks for listening to the show. Got a nice little prize pack, about $50 worth of souvenirs from WrestleMania 34 in New Orleans. Some great stuff. I love the hat, love the poster, and the program has a lot of cool value. It's a good little coffee table book. I think you're going to really like it. We're going to have a live drawing next Saturday night during the last call. I will be announcing the winner live on the air, and I will be making contact with you via your email address that you submitted. And I'll get the mailing address information and everything. It's not going to cost you anything. I'll take care of all the shipping fees if there are any. So it's free to play. There's absolutely no cost, no obligation. I run a good, clean, wholesome show here, folks. So, hey, you're going to get some WrestleMania swag, having fun. That's a pretty good thing, just listening to this rinky-dink podcast, I'd say. So definitely, if you haven't already entered, please give it an enter. Let's see if we can't get 15 or 16 people in this contest next week. Also, if you do win and tweet out the merch that you get from me, I will send you a bonus prize, a WWE Network gift card. So I'm going to up the ante a little bit here. If you win the drawing and are willing to tweet out this gear and plug the show in the process, I'll throw in a WWE Network gift card, let you subscribe to the network so you don't have to pay for it yourself. I'm a generous guy. What can I say? That is the trivia question. The final 4 entrants, final 4 participants in the 1990 Royal Rumble, guys. Get those answers in. I'll be doing the drawing next week. Up until the drawing time itself, I will be taking submissions. So good luck to everyone that's already entered. WWE Network Match of the Week. We're going to close out on this. I want to direct your attention to 1992, the WCW archives, the pay-per-view archives on the WWE Network. If you have not seen this match from WrestleWar 1992, I heartily recommend that you check this match out. Now, WrestleWar 92 is an interesting pay-per-view. It's one of the culmination points for the Dangerous Alliance angle that WCW ran in 1991 and 1992. If you're not familiar with the Dangerous Alliance, think a weird hybrid between the Four Horsemen and the NWO. They had sort of an outlaw feel to them, but they were also much more of a classical stable than the NWO were. It was one of the best angles that WCW ever ran. And it culminated with one of the greatest matches in WCW history. Now, Wrestle War 92 overall is not that great of a show. Now, there is an Easter egg in this show for New Japan fans. I'm not going to give it to you. The Steiner brothers wrestled Tatsumi Fujinami and a very young tag team partner of Fujinami's. And if you watch this, I'm interested to see how many people may recognize him from the current New Japan product. But I'm just going to leave that as a little Easter egg. It was an excellent tag team match between the Steiners, Fujinami and his partner. Brian Pillman, the late, great Brian Pillman, wrestled his former tag team partner on the show, Tom Zink. That was for the WCW Light Heavyweight Championship. Of course, before WCW did their Cruiserweight title in the mid-90s, they had a Light Heavyweight Championship. And next week's WWE Network Match of the Week is also involving the Light Heavyweight Championship. So that's a little spoiler alert for next week's match from Super Brawl 2. This show, Wrestle War 92, though, is remembered for one thing and one thing only: War Games. The 92 War Games match between Sting Squadron and the Dangerous Alliance is by far one of the greatest War Games matches that have ever been run, one of the greatest matches WCW has ever put on air, and it's just one of the greatest matches in wrestling history. Now, a War Games match is a very tricky thing. There have been a lot of bad War Games matches over the years. I have taken the controversial opinion that the 92 War Games match was the last great one that WCW ever did. NXT's version of the War Games was intriguing, and it was a good match. It was a good car crash match. It wasn't a true War Games match in the same vein that the concept existed as in the NWA and WCW. So if you want to see an OG War Games match, a real down and dirty, violent, bloody brawl, I want you to get on the network and find Wrestle War 1992. It's the main event of the show. Honestly, it's one of the biggest collections of in-ring talents that you're going to find in a single match, especially in WCW. Sting Squadron features Sting, of course, legendary wrestler, Barry Windham, one of the best in-ring workers of the 80s. Dustin Rhodes, Goldust, is in this match, along with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, one of my all-time favorites, and Nikita Koloff. They're taking on the Dangerous Alliance. Get this lineup: Ravishing Rick Rude, the Enforcer Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Larry Zbyszko, and Steve Austin. Yes, stunning Steve Austin with his Mel Gardner look going on is in this match. It's a bloody match. It's a violent match. It's a great match. Wrestle War 92, the War Games match between the Sting Squadron and the Dangerous Alliance. That is our WWE Network Match of the Week. Can't praise it enough, guys. It's an awesome match. You're going to love it. Get on the network and check it out. My voice is cracking out, and Lord knows the internet could go out at any time. Get those contest answers in this week. I appreciate the viewership, guys. I love each and every one of you. I hope you enjoyed it tonight. I'm getting out of here. It's the last call with Biff Kensington and the Queen City Express. Have a good week, guys. Take care.